Good evening. My name is Esther Peters. I'm the Associate Director for the Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies at the University of Chicago. And I'm excited to welcome everyone to tonight's series of voices with Kenneth Moss. Series of Voices is an author-centered series of readings and conversations on books from or about Central and Eastern Europe, Russia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. Our long-term partner for this series is the Seminary Co-op Bookstores, the first not-for-profit bookstores whose mission is bookselling. While the bookstores are currently closed, they continue to fulfill orders online and support book sales for virtual events like this one through their website, semcoop.com. You can find information about this series and other events that are being hosted by our center and by the bookstore at our websites, which are also in the chat. If you are interested in joining our listserv to find out more about events that we will be doing in the future, please email us at ceres@uchicago.edu. That is also in the chat box. If you're interested in catching up on past events in this series and other events, I encourage you to take a look at our YouTube channel where you can find videos going back to even when we were doing this in person and in the bookstore. So, as I mentioned, we are excited to welcome Kenneth Moss to discuss his recently published book, An Unchosen People, Jewish Political Reckoning in Interwar Poland. Professor Moss is the Harriet and Ulrich E. Meyer Professor of Jewish History in the College at the University of Chicago, a historian of modern Jewish politics, culture, and thought. His work focuses on how Jewish visions of cultural and political self-determination born in the age of nationalism have been realized, unmade, or recast in the 20th century. He is the author of Jewish Renaissance in the Russian Revolution, which won the Samiror Prize of the National Jewish Book Council. His work has appeared in Yiddish, Hebrew, Polish, Russian, German, and Portuguese, as well as English. He will be joined in conversation this evening by Tara Zahra and James Loeffler. Professor Zahra is the Homer J. Livingston Professor of East European History in the College at the University of Chicago. Her research focuses on the transnational history of modern Europe, migration, the family, nationalism, and humanitarianism. She is most recently the author of The Great Departure, Mass Migration and the Making of the Free World, and with Leora Auslander, Objects of War, the Material Culture of Conflict and Displacement. James Loeffler is the J. Berkowitz Professor of Jewish History at the University of Virginia, where he also serves as Ida and Nathan Koldish Director of the Jewish Studies Program. Between 2013 and 2015, he was a Mellon Foundation New Directions Fellow in International Law and Dean's Visiting Scholar at the Georgetown University Law Center. At UVA, he teaches courses in Jewish and European history, Russian and East European history, international legal history, and the history of human rights. He is a co-convener of the UVA Human Rights Research Network, a faculty partner in the UVA Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab, and co-editor of the Association for Jewish Studies Review. And two last notes before I turn things over to our speakers this evening. We will be giving away up to 10 copies of An Unchosen People. If you are interested in a copy, please let us know by putting your name and email address in the chat. And I also want to let everyone know that there will be time for questions at the end of the event. We would encourage you to use the Q&A box. It is open and you can enter your questions at any time. And with that, I will turn it over to Professors Moss, Loeffler, and Zahra.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am absolutely delighted to have the chance to moderate this event in which we will discuss, but also celebrate the publication of Ken Moss's new book. In my opinion, these events have been one of the real treats of Zoom. It's a chance for the community at the U of C to come together, but also the field to talk about new books. And this is a really exciting one. So we're going to start I'm going to start by turning the screen over to Ken, who's going to introduce the book for a brief period for those of you who haven't had the chance to read it yet. And then we'll have a question or response from Jim Loeffler. I might add a question as well, and then we'll turn things over to the audience for more questions and discussion. Okay, so Ken, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, my warm thanks to Esther, to everyone at CEERES, as well as the Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies, which is co-organizing this. And my warmest thanks to Tara and to Jim for taking part. It's really an honor to have you guys here to discuss the book. An honor to have the chance to discuss it with such extraordinary scholars and thinkers whose work has so shaped my own. And finally, let me, I don't know who's in the audience. I'm looking forward to finding out, but it's very ennobling and heartening to see so many people. Let me add that I really genuinely would like to know what you think of An Unchosen People, should you have the chance or inclination to read it. And I hope that you'll feel free to be in touch with me to discuss it if you should read it. So let me begin. And I quote, even Trotsky has begun to believe that Hitler will remain in power some 10 to 20 years. That which has happened in Germany with its relatively small Jewish community is only a hint of the catastrophe that will break out in those lands where Jews make up a population of millions. By the time the storms finally grow still, the Jewish people will be crushed and broken. Now, this dark vision of the future that awaited Poland's 3 million Jews and their nearly 2 million co-religionists in Romania, Lithuania, Latvia, Hungary was not voiced in 1939 with German troops massed at Poland's borders, but in October 1933, in an essay in one of Warsaw's few politically independent Yiddish journals, written by a Vilna Jewish university student and cultural activist named Michal Oster. And Oster added to this grim vision a harsh message to his fellow Polish Jews that none of the political ideologies or tools that they had been banking on to help them were likely to avail them of anything much. To those who urged Polish Jews to, quote, carry on the old politics of fighting for Jewish well-being in Poland's parliament, municipalities, and streets, Oster essentially scoffed. He said it was delusion to think that any variety of political effort by 10% of Poland's population, of some 30 million people, could have much effect on how Poland, much less all of Europe, would answer what had come to be called the Jewish problem. Any lingering hopes that the international community would protect Jews merited, as he put it, only a bitter smile at the naive ideas of the Jewish liberals who believe that the world is becoming more humanitarian. And as for revolution, Oster himself was actually a very committed Marxist and socialist in his own way, but he saw the approach of the two dominant forces in Polish Jewish socialism, the Social Democratic Bund and the communists, as telling Jews to, quote, wait with our hands in our pockets until the social revolution comes, and then everything will be fine. And Oster drew the consequences of his grim judgment thus, quote, if we take as given that we cannot hope for an improvement in Jewish life in the diaspora, we must seek another path. So in our histories of the modern Jewish experience and in our reflections on that history's larger significance, what place is merited by thought like Oster's? I think that many of my fellow Jewish historians, perhaps many on the call, will feel and acknowledge a worry that framing Jewish history with a figure like Oster threatens to foreclose more than it reveals, threatens to impose a teleology that prevents serious attention to whole worlds of Jewish life, thought, and creativity. Now, my fellow Polish Jewish historians will know that the grim vision of Jewish futurelessness like Oster's was hardly rare. On the contrary, although we can debate how many optimists versus pessimists there were, and I hope you'll, by the end of this talk, you'll agree with me that we should never use those terms again for this topic. It's clear to everybody, as it was at the time, that numerous Jews in Poland and other East European successor states believe their prospects to be bad. But these same historians will tell you, rightly, as they have done in a vast and rich historiography, that such views were far from universal. Masses of Jews continue to aspire to integration as Poles, or to envision revolutionary social transformation, or remain committed to religious piety and to traditional hopes in divine providence. So what claim should the Osters of Poland have on her historical imagination? Now, needless to say, I've come to believe in the course of writing this book that we miss some truly essential dimensions of modern Jewish history and maybe modern history in general if we allow ourselves to sequester voices like Oster's. But I spent some time on the countervailing impulse because I want to be clear about what exactly I think it means to return our attention correctly to these so-called pessimistic voices and what that might yield. At the very beginning of this project, as I began to read for myself through the many sources testifying to the spreading sense of futurelessness among many Polish Jews, I shared, genuinely trying to reconstruct my own thought process, but I generally shared an uncertainty and discomfort about how to construe the importance of such texts. I had the sense of being stuck with equally unsatisfying pseudo-analytical choices to either call these figures prophets or to dismiss them as pessimists. But one thing I came to see, and that really first began to convince me that there was a history here that needed to be told, was that among the Astors of Poland, there were many who were anything but unreflective. If you want to call them pessimists or not, they were not unreflective. They were rather thinking people who tried desperately, and there are many sources that showed this, to gain analytical traction on what was going on around them, on the changes they could see happening around them, not only in Poland, but across Europe, not least in Germany. In late 1933, when a woman named Miriam Shlomovitz, later Shalev, came from Palestine as an emissary of the kibbutz movement to try and get a handle on an unforeseen influx of young Polish Jews into Zionist youth organizations, she was both upset and impressed by what she found. She found that the young people flowing into these organizations were not the sort of true believers she was. They were indifferent to core Zionist ideas about Hebrew, the cult of labor, the new Jew, but she was profoundly struck by the intellectual intensity and wide-ranging reading with which they, including in very small towns, quote, seek an answer for their many questions bearing on both Poland and Palestine, including questions about the nature of nationalism, the sources of ethnic strife, and, quote, what is the source of antisemitism, end quote. And Shlomovitz's report is one of many sources that, taken together, pointed me toward what I think is a first insight in the book, perhaps, and one worked out in conversation, particularly with the work of the late Ezra Mendelsohn, as well as younger scholars like Kamil Kijek, Dan Heller, and Rona Yona, pointing me to a quiet revolution in the character of Polish Jewish political thinking at the grassroots, that a significant number of Polish Jewish people of every sort were moving simultaneously toward profound skepticism about all of the old ideologies on offer, and also toward a keen drive to understand the processes taking shape around them, a practical-minded hunger to know what was going on, how dangerous it really was, or how to even know how to answer that question, and what, if anything, could be done about it. And I think this recognition crystallized for me a kind of moral obligation, a sense that we owed it to these people to take them seriously, not to typologize them as pessimists. At the same time, I began to see a much more straightforward reason to take them seriously. And this became what I think of as a second central argument of An Unchosen People. I discovered that when we actually engage with their thought, we found that many of them were groping toward fascinating, troubling, and resonant insights about topics that confound many Jews, and by no means only Jews today, as at the time. Questions about the relationship of nationalism, democracy, populism, and fascism. Questions about the sources of the unforeseen power and acceleration of right-wing sentiments, of exclusion, conspiracy, fear politics. Questions about the unforeseen weakness of liberal and progressive institutions, something they could see around them, even in a Poland that was under a moderate, if semi-authoritarian regime, but a regime that had was stretching an increasingly thin membrane of quiet over a very, very divided and increasingly scary political life, to say nothing of what they saw across the border in newly Nazi Germany. They were asking questions about whether economic woe and problems of development are more prone to engender new forms of unity or new forms of division and enmity. So one dimension of An Unchosen People, and this is concentrated particularly, I guess, in chapter 4, but it's dispersed, is it's an intellectual history, in part, of how some searching thinkers looked past reassuring progressive truisms to try and understand the unexpected powers of anti-Jewish myth in Europe, the changing relationship between mass politics and the choices of political elites, and a liberal nationalism's unexpected capacity to outflank traditions of political tolerance and to redefine the terms of public life. Some, as I try and show, turned in a psychological direction, began to ask about affect, about forms of enmity, hatred, and fear that might pre-exist or perdure beyond what we thought of as expanding rationality. Others wrestled toward more structural intuitions, might call them sort of political science intuitions, about what could go wrong for minorities in nation states and why, and asked themselves particularly whether, even though some elites in this Polish nation state, as in others, really did try and balance their concerns for the commonweal of the Polish nation with equality for all, Jews might be becoming precocious observers of how this balance could be undone by some citizens' enmities against dangerous minorities. So The Astors are important at one level because it's they who both grappled most seriously with questions of Jewish emancipation and its fragility in this period, and they became precocious inquirers into the central questions that I think are the central questions of modern social thought, whether modernity as an ensemble of forces is at the end of the day pulling us toward tolerance and reason, or is actually inciting new kinds of irrationality, new capacities for enmity in hearts and minds. Much of the rest of the book stretches beyond this kind of intellectual history to try to reconstruct how some Polish Jews confronted this crisis of futurity and the objective factors that fed it, not only in theory, but in practice. In that sense, it's a history of Jewish politics, but it's a history of Jewish politics of a peculiar sort. And to come back to Astor for just a minute, he twinned his analytical concern to understand what sorts of danger were taking shape around Jews with an equally scary claim, as I said, made to his fellow Jews, that none of the forms of political organization they could reach for, and they tried over the past 30 to 40 years, were likely to help them, or more particularly, were likely to help most of them, right? And at the same time, he said it may be that we ought to, that we have to, that we have no choice, but to recast our politics in explicit recognition, not only of danger, but of terribly limited resources and capacities. Maybe we need to recast our politics around the aim of helping some, maybe only a few, rather than fool ourselves into thinking we can help all. Now, this aspect of Astor's thought points us to what I think of as the heart of the book, the sort of third and largest sweep of its argument, which is to trace what I've come to see as a very painful emergence of a whole family of Jewish political ideas, impulses, practical efforts, built around this grim view that Jews actually had quite limited resources, collectively understood, to affect their own fate. That Jewish politics might only have the possibility of helping some, whatever form of politics that might be, and that this might enjoin or mean or force people to choose between things that matter to them, between ideals and identities on the one hand, and political exigency on the other, between the needs of individuals and the needs of the community. And in various parts of the book, I trace how these intuitions began to reshape quite disparate parts of Jewish life and thought. At one point in chapter 3, I turned toward questions of culture, particularly as they are hashed out in diaspora circles of those who remain committed to the view that Jewish life should continue to be nurtured and shaped in a broadly national sense in the diaspora. And I'm interested in figures there who came to see no real political options for them to improve the Jewish situation and to ask themselves instead, what happens to people when they come under the pressure of these sorts of sort of a stigmatization and forms of exclusion that there's nothing to be done about, and that happens for a prolonged amount of time. Some turn in interesting ways toward thinking about the Jewish case in a kind of comparative mode, thinking, for instance, about whether the African-American experience, violent exclusion and imposed identity is a useful or important or exigent way to think about it. Others turn toward a more practical question, which is, are there cultural means from various forms of economic interventions to various kinds of poetry and literature that can at least confront despair itself, restore hope, change aspirations, build endurance, salve wounded subjectivity. And in some sense, this becomes an investigation of a moment when visions of how culture was to be used to create a new identity, to create a new Jewish modernity of Jews' own choosing, gave way to something like thinking about culture as a kind of ongoing first aid. Another part of the book moves from this maybe recondite set of questions about poetry to much more straightforward questions of mass politics, and tries to recapture what I think is a profound shift in how large numbers of Polish Jews related to Zionism in this era, in a way that I think is a watershed in the history of Zionism generally. I argue in chapters 2, 6, 7, et cetera, that many Polish Jews in this period negotiated a very different kind of relationship to Zionism and to the perhaps unique Jewish national community that was taking shape in Palestine under the pressure of this dual sense of danger and limited Jewish capacities. In the context of an accidental opening of Palestine by the British to substantially larger numbers of Jewish immigrants, but still far fewer than wanted to go, Polish Jews, I argue, became one of the first Jewries, and maybe not the last, to negotiate a relationship to the Zionist project defined neither by the canons of Zionism nor by the canons of anti-Zionism, but by a pressing practical question. Was it true, and for whom might it be true, as Zionism advertised, that the Yishuv offered possibilities for a better life for some than they could attain in Europe? And questions that had long pivoted on cultural issues of identity became instead for many an inquiry about whether and where Jews, or at least some Jews, might find a chance at a better life. And finally, and here I'll end, even though it's the most amorphous and complicated dimension of the book, I try to excavate beyond these particular movements of diasporas and Zionism, what I've come to think of as a sort of intimate history of how Polish Jewish individuals of all sorts wrestled with the implications of danger and powerlessness for their own Jewishness, for their relationship to the Jewish community, and to their relationship with their families. I ask how they wrestled with the problem of whether cherished visions of Jewish life, culture, and identity might have to give way to very practical questions of exigency, and also how they wrestled with what individuals owe the community and when what they owe the community ceases to obtain. So with that, I'll stop. I know that last part is a bit abstract, but I'll look forward, hopefully, to fleshing that a little bit in conversation with you.
Thanks so much. That was wonderful. I know how challenging it is to summarize a book in 15 minutes, but you've given us a really great taste of its richness. And I think hopefully it's clear that a lot of people want to read more from the chat. I don't think I've ever seen so much demand for free copy. So we're off to a good start here. I'm going to turn things over to Jim first to respond and maybe pose a few questions. But listening to you, I came with some questions, raised some more for me. And I hope that those of you in the audience will also take the opportunity to pose some questions as well in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi there. Well, first of all, I want to say it's a real pleasure as well as an honor to be here to celebrate the book and to interrogate the book, as I know its author would like us to do, to really press deeply into its arguments and its sources and its process as a piece of writing. And it's quite remarkable in that respect. Ken said that if you should read the book, and I would say you must read the book, because this is a book that, as you already heard from Ken himself, it not only grapples with some of the big questions of modernity and the Jewish experience of it, and it not only grapples with the big questions about how to think about the Jewish past in Europe before the Holocaust without assuming the Holocaust is coming, right? And scholars on this call will know, without assuming the teleology in there. But it really just gives us something remarkable in terms of an empathic investigation of people's minds, and I think actually that it's one of the biggest challenges for historians in terms of method to be able to tease out what people are experiencing, right? And we have different strategies for doing that, and we rely on words above all, but that's always kind of carries with a danger of deception. And one of the things that you see in this book when you read it is that Ken has not only taken seriously people's lives and experiences in the moment, but he's read them with incredible intensity and empathy, which allows him to draw out all of these observations about what's really happening at that time. And so I want to basically, I could, like Tara, I could go on for a long time and rhapsodize and ask lots of different questions. I want to, however, just make one comment and then pose two questions to sort of open things up. The first comment is, it really is compelling to see a book about one of the most exciting, interesting moments in modern East European Jewish history that's not framed simply, as you heard Ken describe, as a moment of dazzling creativity in the face of crisis, or as a moment just of degradation, but as a moment of failure, right? And we don't have enough histories of Jewish failure. It's one of, I think, the things he gestured at in his opening comments and explores in the book, our impulse to want to redeem the past or to want to use the past to challenge the present. And sometimes we have to pause and see that the Jewish experience might be defined by not just victimization or by self-exoneration in symbolic forms, but by just failure, right? Running out of choices and options. And as he puts it so well, this sense of no future. So with that, I want to turn to two questions that came to mind in the moments when I heard Ken describe this book in the early stages and then reading versions of it. And they come to mind again in thinking about this conversation tonight. And the first is the question of imagining the global. So one of the things that's so remarkable about this book is that we're able to see how people could look and reason and compare themselves to the experience of racialized minorities, to African Americans. The results Ken shows us are sometimes complicated and sometimes uncomfortable by our standards, but they're very revealing. And he shows us how there's this interest in understanding what's happening to them. There are Polish Jews at the time, and I'll confess I think about someone I'm interested in, which is Raphael Lemkin, who's living through this moment. He also feels himself experiencing this condition. I think it fits really well. But there's this impulse in him, and I think in some others, to still try and find one kind of exit, right? If all the possibilities of politics seem to be closing off. And for him, it's this exit of international law. And I think it's what I'm curious about from Ken is, let's say Lemkin is atypical. Let's say most of these other intellectuals are not thinking about sort of creative utopian projects or turning to international governance or imperial powers with creative gambits. Let's say they're not doing that. Why not? And I was just sort of curious about that. If there's a foreclosure and there's no political route, you talk about how they turn to the psychic aid of poetry, and you talk about a lot of the different moves that are made. But I'm curious about why there's not more of, I guess we could call it a utopian move that appears. Is that also reflecting, our assumptions that there ought to be? Is it ignoring something about what is possible? But the idea of imagining a choice beyond the absence of choice. And I'm just curious about that. And the second thing is I'd like to ask Ken to say something about this question of these people as a paradigm of modernity, or at least of Jewish modernity. So in the closing parts of the book, he explores this issue of how much can we say this is representative of something. After all, this is a community living through the age of the rising fascism in Europe. This is a community, right, living through an illiberal moment. This is a community that is grappling with the first impact of eliminationist policies and realities that we would now call genocide. So what I'm curious about is he at times, Ken, you tell us that this could be something that really beckons to be taken seriously, not as the people who are sort of left behind by all those brilliant Weimar German Jewish intellectuals, but by people who are just as important or perhaps more important because they've seen something earlier, because it's been pressed up against them. And I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about that. Do you think this can stand in or displace German Jewish intellectuals of great fame who are experiencing something at the same time, or can this displace the Marxist universalists, the Marxist internationalists, right? Those who've been heralded in recent years, I'm not thinking in the Polish context, but in the Soviet context, right? Iri Sloskin's people as the true moderns, the true, most modern of the modern Jews, and therefore most modern of the moderns. So I'd love to hear you just maybe situate it a little bit in terms of the other big storylines we think about when we think about Jews and modernity in Europe. And are these folks outliers? Are they embedded in their own reality and interconnected, or are they actually something that really is the most modern of the modern Jews?
Well, those are, as I should have suspected, those are very fertile questions, and also really, I think very hard questions to give an adequate answer to. I'll do what I can, because they tap into the book's many different layers. I mean, I really appreciate. I mean, I appreciate very much your opening sort of praise of the empathic dimension of the book, and there's something I do feel sort of kind of accomplishment about in the book that it feels solid. It is the very granular kind of time I've spent with these people, and my sense that I understand something about the kind of impasses they were facing. But But I did try and, I mean, we all have to, and I don't mean this cynically, I mean this, it's important to ask, what, if anything, can we take away from this other than some kind of encounter with human experience? And I don't know that I came to clear answers, and I'll do what I can. And you ask a question in a couple of different ways. You also ask kind of a very interesting kind of middle ground sort of empirical questions also about the absence of something. And I have to think hard about how to answer that usefully. But I also want to begin by saying, I really appreciate also your intuition, your account of the way in which this is partially an effort to look at failure and impasse as distinct from foreordained, or distinct from doom or creativity. I owe a lot of a debt, not to stick other people with my mistakes, but I owe a tremendous debt in my mind to a series of books that I do think are kind of the places where people really thought about failure. And several articles by the late Ezra Mendelsohn, where he sort of asks, why do we end up replaying this sort of imaginary vote of which Jewish movement we think was the best, when in fact, if the question is which of these movements succeeded in securing something really robust for most Jews, the answer is none of them, with the very partial exception of Zionism, right? I also think of David Engel's work, which to me is also kind of shaped by some of the past, and very much also this work of these young scholars I mentioned in passing, who are all in various ways scholars of Jewish youth culture and youth politics, who take very different approaches to it and ask different questions, but all point us to the ways in which maybe the question about the 30s, at least, and I think maybe it's a question more generally of modern Jewish politics, and that is not which of these movements strikes us as sort of more convincing, which may just be a stand-in for congenial, but rather, what if we're missing the forest for the trees, which is that large numbers of people are starting to think none of this is going to help, or if it is, it might only help me. Yeah. This might be a way to think a little bit about Lemkin. I'm tempted to say a couple things. I'm tempted to say, you may have put your finger on a gap in the book that's just a crude empirical gap, which is Lemkin, as you show. No, this is not backpatting. Your book, among other things, introduces us to whole circle figures around Lemkin, that could connect to Lemkin, who come out of the world of jurisprudence, legal studies, who are really genuinely part of the Polish, and in some sense, pan-European legal intelligentsia. They have tools to think like this, and it may be, and this would be an indictment of my work in some sense, that as much as I think the work tries to capture lots of different sorts of Jews thinking about these problems, it really doesn't have as much, it doesn't spend enough time with those circles. I will say, and to turn that to less into a sort of a question of what's missing, I will say there is one figure who does embrace these ideas, but they can't go anywhere because he has no one to listen to him. And this is this figure, Alfred Golem, a figure of great significance in the fairly small world of really intensely committed Yiddishism, a figure who combines really hardcore commitment to the diasporist vision with a very dark vision of what's going to happen to Polish Jews. He sort of says, he's writing already in 33, like Oster is. They know each other, but disagree on political choices. But he's writing essentially the same things about how things are really clearly going to get bad, very bad in Eastern Europe, if they're going to get that bad in Germany, essentially, is what he's saying. And he has these kind of very utopian visions of, can't we, sort of the Jewish people at an international level, appeal in the name of a sort of international experience, a unity of fate and circumstance, to the League of Nations for basically protection of our rights as an extraterritorial minority everywhere we are, right? I mean, the answer is you could appeal to them, but right, as Carol Fink showed us, and as you showed, to whom were you going to appeal and under what circumstances? So he just says that on the pages of a Yiddish journal, and you think to yourself, well, who's going to hear that, right? So there's some question here, I think, of who can speak. It's not they weren't thinking about it. It's that seemed even less realistic, perhaps, than a whole variety of other sorts of things they could imagine trying to do. I'm not sure that's an adequate answer, but I think it begins there. And there are figures who are thinking in those terms. And you could kind of construct a story where weirdly they're not that distant from the way Hannah Arendt is thinking in that same period, or the way Lemkin is thinking in that same period. But I don't think any of them feel all that much faith by the 30s that the League of Nations or anything else really can help them much. And it might, and I also had to stop at a certain point and say, I don't see much energy being devoted to that because, and I have to assume that's because they just don't think there's much there for them. Let me speak to your larger, very complex question about who these people are as a paradigm of modernity, and also what it would mean what it might mean to talk about a paradigm of modernity. And I'm intrigued and genuinely, genuinely share some of the inclinations that I think are built into the question. I might say this though about Weimar, which is I'm not sure that I want to cast this as the question of who's the most paradigmatic. And in some sense, I think you yourself said this at some point, and other people have said this to me over the years, many years this has taken, that in a certain strange way, many of my Polish Jews come out sounding more like German Jews than we'd anticipated, in the sense that even though we think of them having this kind of plenitude of cultural difference, this rich, thick Jewishness that Jewish historians we should admit, are often very attracted to, and German Jews don't have it. There's other reasons that Jewish historians find them attractive, right? But they're of course paradigmatically the opposite, as it were. They assimilated completely, and then look what happened, right? It's like right. But whatever sources of thought they had were generatively born essentially out of the German experience and the German critical tradition. And that's what's so fascinating about them. Whereas East European Jews, these guys have Jewish culture, right? But in a sense, I think what I found was that these were people who, the ones I'm looking at, not everybody, felt the irrelevance of whatever culture, of questions of identity even, to the questions that face them about political choices to be made. And they end up, as it were, by chapter 7, we end up dealing with people like, there's a figure that we've talked a lot about, this figure Benjamin Reisch, a young man who wrote not only an autobiography at the time, but a kind of complex response to a very interesting work of sociology about Polish Jewish youth that he sent to the author thereof. And he's someone who is not ashamed of his Jewishness. He's not trying to integrate into anything. In fact, he has rather chauvinist views of his Polish compatriots. He's a big fan of and serious consumer of fairly recondite Yiddish culture. All these, he's sort of a figure who embodies what's supposed to be paradigmatic about Polish Jewry, not least, or East European Jewry, not least. And yet he says quite explicitly, and this is why he gets sort of prime billing, as it were, he says, none of that's relevant anymore to what I want or need to do. And he goes and joins a Zionist youth movement, not because, and he's quite clear of this, not because he's convinced by much of its claims about, diaspora weakness and the new Jew. He thinks Hebraism's a crock. He thinks that kids he knows from the Hebrew school, the Hebrew language schools, don't understand what they're saying, literally. But none of that is relevant, because joining that movement gives him a small but non-negligible chance at getting a certificate to go to Palestine. And he's concluded that's all there is for him. And he knows it's not going to help anybody. He says there's no medicines that are going to help the whole community. So let's take what we can get for the people who can get it. And it's a very, it's wrenching and it's uncomfortable. And someone like the person he's writing to is appalled by this in a lot of ways. And maybe that's kind of paradigmatic. I do think, they are paradigmatic insofar as the modern experience is finding out you don't have the right categories to understand the dangers unfolding around you, finding out how limited your resources really are, or knowing they're limited, not knowing exactly how to measure how limited they are, right? Trying to figure out the right balance between explaining and extrapolating, trying to figure out when to make a decision in the face of things that are scary, but but decisions are hard to make. How do you know when you should make a decision, right? How do you quantify danger? These kinds of questions, to me, are paradigmatic, unfortunately, for a lot of us. And I think these figures, to me, embody that far more than, or at least as much, and it's like, at least as much as figures who embody for good or for ill, the kind of various idealisms and true belief sensibilities that we might associate with Sloskin's folks. And that maybe one last thing I'll say is that I think that, as I say in the introduction, there's a lot of great work that's been written and will yet be written about many kinds of true believers in Polish Jewish life. But this is a book about people who had grown skeptical, worried, and fairly convinced that their categories with which they'd entered the 30s were not adequate to understanding what they were dealing with, and they had to find new ones and fast, and they had to reconsider things they really had hoped they felt were important, and maybe abandon them, right? And that, I think, is somewhat paradigmatic of a lot of modern life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I could go on, but I think like many of us, I'd love to hear Tara chime in.
Well, I feel like there's so much to say, and we don't have as much time as we'd like, and this conversation is just great to listen to. But I first encountered this book, as Ken will remember, because we had or have an overlapping interest in emigration. And I learned a great deal about emigration from reading this book. But I'd be interested in hearing Ken's thoughts at this point about how your own thoughts about migration or emigration, or the aspiration to emigrate, and what that symbolizes, how that came out in the end for you. So in a book that's about futurelessness, I wonder what migration symbolized for people. Is it a future or futurelessness, or did it depend on who you were talking about? It strikes me that one of the things that I love about this book is that, I mean, you call it a book of Jewish political thought, but your sources themselves and the places in which you find political thought are very broad and eclectic, from, youth essays and diaries to discussions of emigration. So if you could just say more about that, I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, well, thank you. And in encounter, as you know, with your book and with a manuscript, actually, which they were generous enough to share with me, really forced me to rethink a lot of the ways in which where I located Jewish politics, and also what migration could mean. And I think the most straightforward answer to, and this is something I think I learned in good part from your book, is I think that migration remains one of the very few things people really do look to offer a future, right? And the problem is there's just not many opportunities that they can see for it, right? So part of what there's a moment in the book where I look at a Jewish organization that was sort of founded to create and facilitate Jewish emigration. And the way I understood that organization owes a lot to the ways in which, among other things, you asked in Great Migration, how nationalists of various sorts try to massage, control, shape migration because they think of people as resource, right? And of their people as their collective resource. And the people in this organization, some of them were Zionists and nationalists of various sorts, and felt that way, and they didn't like the idea of just helping people get out to go anywhere. But some of them in that organization are pulled in the other direction to the point where they say, look, we can't be worried about massaging and directing. We just have to find any way out for anyone who can get out. And they don't really have any resources to do that beyond, essentially informational resources. They do some language classes. They run language classes in Spanish and English, right? They're not trying to control at that point. They're trying to help people who can leave. And very late in the 30s, a whole variety of figures, including those, again, who would certainly fall in a kind of nationalist camp, who start saying things like, we have to teach Jewish would-be migrants, we have to basically help them redo their habitus so that and also educate them to be productive so that they can kind of get in through the very narrow, frameworks that had been set up mostly to keep them out. So I think in that sense, we, across in different places in this social world, migration is increasingly thought of as really one of the very few kinds of if exit is thought of one of the few kinds of futures that maybe an individual can get his or her hands around. And then in some ways, that's also, I think, key to the way I ended up thinking about Zionism. That it's certainly not the case. I don't argue that everybody who's attracted to and drawn to and gets involved in Polish Zionism is indifferent to Zionist ideology. There are plenty of people who are in it for various kinds of visions of self-reinvention and so forth. But a lot of people are drawn to it and will say so quite openly, simply because, and I don't simply, initially because, let's say, for reasons that has nothing to do with what Polish Jews want or didn't want, briefly, between 32 and 36, Palestine becomes arguably the easiest place for a Jew from Poland to get to if he or she has no substantial economic resources. Most can. There's a cap, there's a hard cap on the number placed by the British, but within that cap, which is renegotiated every 6 months or something, the certificates actually are in the hands of the Zionist organization, the Jewish agency. And so affiliating with the Zionist movement becomes actually a practical way of getting a shot at one of those certificates. And so you see people who will say quite explicitly, I have no intention of going to a kibbutz when I get to Palestine, who work very hard to find out what's really going on there. And this is why I took back the word simply. I think one that's sort of interesting to me is you've people who are drawn to the movement out of this raw emigrationist sentiment. And then they also want to know, is all the stuff I'm hearing, in Zionist propaganda, and for that matter, anti-Zionist propaganda, how much of any of it is true? Would life there really be better? If I managed to get there, where would I go? And you see them looking, and this was hard to find, but you see people reaching out for many kinds of information, right? Trying to get personal letters, because they don't want to listen to the folks from the kibbutz movement tell them what they ought not to expect and do. They want to know, is there something that's really possibly better there? And emigration in that sense, precisely in the epicenter of what's supposed to be the alternative to mere emigration, right? The Zionist movement is very much a driving force, and I think a political vision, but a political vision only for the self.
That's really interesting. Thanks. I'm going to indulge one more question, even though I do see that there's some questions in the Q&A. And that's given the forum here, I very much hope that historians of Eastern Europe who don't necessarily normally work in Jewish history will read this book. I'm wondering, you came from writing about a different context, Imperial Russia, into the world of interwar Poland. I'm wondering what you learned or what you think readers should take away from this book about East European politics and Poland specifically in this period. I mean, clearly that it was bad for Jews, but in a deeper way, or
unclearly that it was bad for Jews.
Right? Yeah, exactly. But beyond that sort of important and obvious takeaway, how did your own thinking about interwar Poland develop as you pursued this project?
I think, I'm not sure if this is a defense or indictment in advance, but I ended up working very hard to understand Poland because I think it really is, it is an incredibly complicated story. It's not a straightforward story by any means. And, Poland, as you of course know, and many people on this call know better than I do, is a place where, where the national movement itself was divided in its relationship to Jews, particularly, and to the whole question of really who would be welcome into the bosom of the nation, and under what circumstances. And importantly, in Poland, as in a lot of the successor states, with maybe the exception of Romania, right? The more liberal elements set the terms. Actually, they set the constitutional terms. Jews are full citizens. They are, they're able within the same fair, somewhat bounded, and censored framework. They're able to speak, to organize, right? And of course, Poland is, a place that's shaped by a coup from the center, and Jews are delighted. They're universally relieved because what they were seeing was the bumpy but unmistakable rise of the nationalist right to dominance, right, over the historically dominant forces of the kind of moderate national camp. All that's to say that, let me begin from a different angle too. I ended up writing about a lot of people who saw a lot of dangers around them in Poland, but very few of those people thought things like Poland is an especially anti-Semitic place in the sense of there's like a heavy miasma of mean-spirited sentiment here. Some did think that. Some discovered that was truer than they thought, maybe, at least they felt. But the folks who wanted to understand what was dangerous in the world around them did not in the first instance think this is sort of a quantum of anti-Semitism that's sort of rising out of the ground. And it's, and we're actually open to the view that it really might only take a minority of people, maybe not that huge minority of people, who really cared to pursue an anti-Semitic politics for a nation state to maybe revert to a certain kind of built-in structure of nation states. I think an argument that I see you making in some ways, that that when the chips are down, national democracy means that it becomes very easy to argue that the state should serve the needs of the real nation, and very hard to argue that it should bend over backwards or sacrifice much or force others to sacrifice for people who really don't belong to the nation. And that's especially true in an era of the Great Depression. Another way to think about your question was, one question was often asked to me, it's a reasonable question, is, well, isn't this about the Depression? And that was one of the questions that Jews themselves asked. They asked, what's the Depression doing to the larger Polish society? Because people were suffering from it. They all around them, right? And I think that, you know, one of the things that struck me about these figures, and I hope it comes across, is they didn't assume that was an irrelevant question. They thought it might be very true that dangerous potentials in this structure are only going to be realized because of larger crisis of capitalism, but that also doesn't, in some sense, also didn't lead them to think, therefore, everything's gonna be fine as soon as things rebound, right? And they wrestle with questions that we've seen people wrestling with in the US context, right? Which is, you know, what is the relationship between economic underdevelopment, need, precariousness, and illiberal politics? You know, so I think in that sense, they become very careful analysts for the most part of Poland. I tried to model the same sense of both openness and real and unignorable danger. The precise question of which was, how do I know how dangerous the danger is? You know, where are we seeing processes and trends, and what might be explaining them, and when do I know things have tipped to something much more concerning?
Yeah.
If I could just jump in with one quick comment, I just to amplify what you're saying, Tara, when you're responding with Ken, I do think this book is hugely important for the history of Polish politics, precisely because it's not a book about Polish anti-Semitism, but it's a book about, you know, as you describe, the foreclosure on Jews of the Polish national project, right? So like you showed that again and again and again, even as you don't, you know, rehearse the arguments that we were all familiar with, which is who was more anti-Semitic, or what was going on, or was it, you know, embedded in society. As you show, a certain condition is emerging that Jews realize, as you describe it, that their Polish neighbors now, even the liberals, now feel captive to.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's right. We have 5 minutes left, which is very sad because there are a number of questions. So I am going to choose one question that I just think is a really good one to finish on, and I'm sure it's one that's on the minds of many people here, which is from our colleague Faith Hillis. She says, thanks for this wonderful discussion. Did writing this book inform your own thinking about contemporary crises, climate change, democratic collapse, etc.?
Well, I mean, I suppose it won't surprise anybody to say it might be even clearer to answer in the other causal direction. I mean, I think, you know, I don't think there's any reason to hide. I don't think this is a bad thing for historians, that I gained a lot more traction in my own sense of understanding how hard it is to know how worrisome rapid growth of a liberalism is, and also how important it is and how exigent it feels to think about it living through the last 5 years in the US. I mean, and not only the US, I mean, you know, a lot of places to which I feel connection are places undergoing real redefinitions around essentially rightist nationalist ways of thinking about who belongs and who the state's for and so forth. I mean, and I defend that, but it'd be a different conversation, right? It's and so I spent a lot of time thinking in those terms, whether having, I mean, maybe Faith's question is a better question than the one I've answered. I mean, how did it inform that? I'm not sure that it helps me think much about the US, because I think in some ways the problems in the US are even are clearer to me in some, and they're rooted in, you know, white supremacy and a variety of things that I think we could all discuss. And they're rooted in, but maybe it's helped me appreciate, and this is actually something Jim's been thinking about in very important and productive ways. It's helped me appreciate, for instance, how quickly forms of thinking that just seem really crazy and can take hold of perfectly reasonable, fairly reasonable people, and also how quickly people can come to see the institutions that you think they have sort of a commitment to as standing in the way of their real interests, and how fragile liberalism is. I mean, and that might come back to Tara's question. I mean, Poland wasn't a paradise of liberal politics, but it was a polity committed to individual rights and a constitution, right? And I mean, and this was held in some kind of complex balance with the fact that it was also a state created by nationalists of various sorts who wanted to realize the Polish commonweal, realize something that was important to them for the Polish people. And they really did try and maintain that balance. And in some sense, you can kind of see how hard it becomes, exactly as Jim put it, about the sort of even their liberal neighbors, as it were, increasingly captive to these illiberal ideas, not necessarily because they share them, because it restructures that sense of possibilities in political life, and it weakens institutions around them. And I think that's probably, I guess that did help me think a little bit about our current situation.
Thank you so much. I think that's a good place to end, although I know we could talk for a lot longer. I hope that everybody who's tuned in tonight will buy the book, win the book, read the book. Those of you who had questions that we didn't get a chance to address, I think you should feel free to reach out to Professor Moss. And thank you all again for coming. And congratulations again to Ken for a truly important and exciting book.
Absolutely.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you to everyone for coming. And I want to thank again, Professors Moss, Loeffler, and Zahra for their time and engaging conversation this evening. I look forward to seeing people both in person and via Zoom in the future. So thank you all.
Thank you all so much for coming. And thanks to Jim and Tara, thanks Esther, and thanks truly to everyone in the audience for spending time with us tonight.